Hello friends, welcome to Buried Truths, where the dust of time is swept away and history's deepest secrets rise to the surface. Let's view the video. British Singapore in the early 20th century was a thriving colonial port, but beneath its economic success lay deep racial and political tensions. Indian soldiers, particularly from the 5th Light Infantry Regiment, served the British Crown, but lived under strict discipline, low pay, and racial discrimination. Resentment simmered quietly for years. These sepoys, mostly Muslims from northern India, were stationed far from home. They endured cultural isolation, food restrictions, and condescending treatment from British officers. The colonial military hierarchy rarely addressed their concerns. Loyalty to the British was eroding, and frustration grew among troops who felt abandoned and dishonored. Religious and political factors began playing a dangerous role. Rumors spread that the British would force Muslim soldiers to fight the Ottoman Empire, the caliphate that many Indian Muslims revered. The idea of going to war against fellow Muslims enraged many sepoys. Loyalty to the crown was being tested on moral and spiritual grounds. At the same time, nationalist sentiments were rising in British India. Movements like the Ghadar Party were calling for an armed uprising against colonial rule. Revolutionary newspapers, smuggled letters, and secret meetings found their way even to Singapore. Indian soldiers stationed abroad were now mentally part of the growing independence struggle. British intelligence failed to notice the warning signs. Officers dismissed complaints as minor issues and ignored rising discontent. Meanwhile, German agents and Indian nationalists were quietly exploiting the situation. Subtle propaganda and anti-British whispers fueled paranoia and revolutionary thoughts within the ranks. By late 1914, the pressure was mounting. Tensions between soldiers and officers intensified, and discipline began to crack. Whispers of revolt circulated in the barracks. Singapore had become a volatile colonial outpost, an ideal flashpoint for rebellion. The storm was building, and the British had no idea what was coming. The 1915 Singapore Mutiny didn't erupt overnight. It was born from years of neglect, injustice, and arrogance. British colonial rule planted the seeds of its own destruction. What happened next would shock the empire and leave a bloody mark on Singapore's history forever. The Ghadar movement, born in 1913 among Indian expatriates in North America, sought to overthrow British rule through armed revolution. Its leaders, mostly Punjabi Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus, believed in one united India, free from colonial domination. The movement's ideas traveled far, finding fertile ground even in distant British outposts like Singapore. Ghadar propaganda, including newspapers like the Ghadar and pamphlets in Urdu, Punjabi, and Hindi, reached Indian soldiers through secret channels. These materials called for mutiny, labeling the British Empire as the enemy of Indian freedom. Revolutionary poetry and articles lit a fire in the minds of the disillusioned sepoys. By late 1914, Ghadar revolutionaries planned synchronized uprisings across India and among Indian troops stationed overseas. The outbreak of World War I offered a perfect opportunity. While the British Empire was distracted fighting Germany and the Ottomans, the Ghadarites aimed to strike from within, using India's own soldiers. Singapore's 5th Light Infantry became a prime target. Soldiers already feeling betrayed by the British due to the Ottoman conflict were especially susceptible. Ghadar agents, posing as traders or travelers, spread their message in Singapore's bazaars, mosques, and coffee houses. The soldiers listened, and some began to believe. One key influence was Nur Alam Shah, a charismatic religious leader who convinced sepoys that the war against the Ottomans was un-Islamic. He warned that dying in such a war would be sinful. His words resonated with Muslim soldiers, especially those torn between duty and faith. While the British suspected seditious activities, they underestimated the Ghadar movement's reach and influence. Security was lax, and internal surveillance was minimal. The empire's arrogance allowed revolutionary seeds to take root in plain sight. Mutiny was not just possible, it was inevitable. The Ghadar movement didn't just spark disobedience, it gave sepoys a cause. No longer were they just disgruntled troops. They saw themselves as part of a global revolution. The countdown to the 1915 mutiny had begun, and the Ghadar fire was burning bright in Singapore. On February 15, 1915, Singapore erupted in chaos. At 3:30 p.m., 4 companies of the 5th Light Infantry suddenly turned on their British officers. It was a calculated strike, quick, shocking, and bloody. The peaceful colonial outpost was instantly transformed into a battlefield. The mutineers first targeted their own leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Martin, the regiment's commanding officer, was among the first to be shot. Other British officers were caught unarmed or during routine duties, completely unaware. The regiment's European and loyal Indian officers fell swiftly, caught off guard by their own men. The soldiers seized weapons and ammunition, locking down key parts of Tanglen barracks. Panic spread through the city as civilians heard gunfire, echoing from the military zone. Within hours, mutineers took control of large parts of the cantonment, their numbers swelling with looted arms. Their fury extended to civilian targets. The rebels killed around 39 British officers, soldiers, and civilians, including women and children. Panic gripped Singapore's European population. Wealthy colonials fled to Raffles Hotel, which soon became a temporary fortress. Shops closed. Streets emptied. The colony had descended into fear. Amid the violence, many civilians tried to escape by boat. Some hid with friendly locals. The colonial administration was paralyzed. Governor Arthur Young was caught completely off guard and could not immediately call for reinforcements. The lack of a standing British garrison made matters worse. The mutineers attempted to reach the German prisoners of war at Tanglen detention barracks, hoping to free them as allies. However, coordination broke down. Many German prisoners, fearing British reprisals or distrusting the rebels, refused to join. The plan to merge forces collapsed. The mutiny had exploded with sudden fury, but it lacked strategy. Within 48 hours, the lack of coordination, leadership, and external support began to show. But at that moment, the rebellion was in full swing, and Singapore stood on the brink of a total colonial disaster. As the sun set on February 15, 1915, Singapore was in total disarray. The mutineers of the 5th Light Infantry held large swaths of the city under their control. Streets around Tanglen, Alexandra, and parts of Orchard Road were eerily quiet, haunted by gunfire, bloodshed, and fear. The British had no standing army in Singapore at the time. With most of their forces deployed in Europe and the Middle East, local officials were paralyzed. The colonial police, poorly trained and lightly armed, were overwhelmed. The rebellion had exposed Singapore's military vulnerability. The rebels set up barricades, controlling key intersections and supply routes. Some looted shops, while others sought shelter in sympathetic homes. Many were driven not by ideology, but by opportunity, fear, or confusion. This made the movement unpredictable and dangerous to everyone, regardless of allegiance. Civilians, especially the European and Chinese communities, were caught in the crossfire. The European Club was attacked. In some areas, terrified residents climbed rooftops or hid in cellars. Rumors of further uprisings by other Indian regiments spread rapidly, though most proved false. Singapore's Malay Regiment and loyal Indian troops were ordered to protect key buildings. But many were hesitant, unsure whether their fellow Indians were enemies or brothers. This hesitation created further chaos, as mutineers exploited the division and struck targets at will. By February 16th, British authorities were able to send frantic telegraphs to request help from nearby colonies. In the meantime, Japanese warships patrolled the harbor to prevent rebel escape. The mutiny had spilled into the port area, threatening trade routes and international shipping lanes. At its peak, the mutiny nearly toppled colonial order in Singapore. For nearly a week, the city was gripped by fear, confusion, and paralysis. The world's most powerful empire had lost control of one of its prized eastern outposts, and the whole world was watching. By February 17, 1915, the British Empire had begun mobilizing a multinational counter-offensive. Telegrams sent days earlier had reached nearby colonies. Reinforcements came swiftly. French, Russian, and Japanese warships docked in Singapore's harbor, each dispatching troops to aid the overwhelmed British authorities. The Japanese were first to respond. Marines from the warship Ottawa landed and moved through the city with precision. Their presence shocked the mutineers. The French sent soldiers from Saigon, while Russian sailors disembarked from the Oral. It was an extraordinary sight, former imperial rivals uniting to suppress a rebellion. British loyalist forces regrouped. The Malay States Guides, Sikh police, units, and remaining loyal Indian troops joined the foreign detachments. Joint patrols swept through rebel-held zones. Skirmishes erupted near Bukit Timah and Pasir Panjang, where rebels tried to regroup. Outgunned and outnumbered, the mutiny began to crumble. The turning point came when the British located and attacked the mutineers' hiding places in the jungles and kampongs outside the city. Villagers, either out of fear or loyalty, helped identify rebel camps. One by one, rebel groups were surrounded, disarmed, or shot after refusing to surrender. Despite their fading strength, some rebels fought with desperation. They hoped for rescue or for reinforcements from other Indian units in Malaya. None came. The Empire's combined forces were ruthless. Armed with superior firepower and intelligence, they showed no mercy. By February 22nd, the last major pockets of resistance had collapsed. Over 200 mutineers had been killed in combat or captured. The city, though battered and grieving, was back under colonial control. The British swiftly declared martial law and began rounding up suspects. The rebellion was over, but the response had just begun. The British had re-established control, not through negotiation, but through overwhelming force. Singapore was scarred, and the Empire had been humiliated, but vengeance would be swift and public in the days to come. With the mutiny crushed by February 22, 1915, Singapore fell into a somber silence. But the British Empire moved swiftly to reassert dominance. Over 200 men were arrested. Makeshift courts-martial were convened in barracks, and justice, swift, severe, and public, became the next chapter in the rebellion. The trials began within days. 63 sepoys were charged with mutiny and murder. Lacking legal defense and held under martial law, most were convicted quickly. The proceedings were closed, but the punishments were meant to be very public. The British wanted to send a chilling message across the empire. 47 soldiers were sentenced to death. On March 15, 1915, the executions began. Mutineers were marched before firing squads and shot in groups at Outram Road Prison and Farrer Park Field. Thousands of locals were forced to watch, including schoolchildren and community leaders. Others were flogged, imprisoned, or sent to penal colonies. Those spared death-faced lifelong exile. Public hangings followed for civilian collaborators. The British wanted to stamp out not only rebellion, but any sympathy for it. Singapore had become a theater of imperial discipline. The scale of violence shocked many. Some European missionaries and local leaders questioned the mass executions. They warned that such harsh reprisals would only deepen resentment. But the colonial authorities stood firm. Rebellion had to be crushed with unflinching force. Yet the mutiny's legacy endured. It exposed the fragility of colonial rule and the dangers of ignoring soldiers' grievances. The British tightened surveillance and racial segregation in the military. Indian soldiers were carefully reassigned, and recruitment practices were changed to prevent similar revolts. The Singapore Mutiny became a turning point in the Indian freedom struggle. Though it failed militarily, it showed the reach of anti-colonial sentiment. From the Ghadar movement to Gandhi's Satyagraha, the desire for independence had awakened, and the empire could no longer ignore it. The 1915 Singapore Mutiny was one of the most significant uprisings within the British Empire during World War I. Yet today, few remember it. Unlike the revolt of 1857 or the Quit India movement, this episode quietly faded from public memory, buried by shame, politics, and imperial censorship. For the British, the mutiny was an embarrassment. It had exposed gaping weaknesses in colonial defense. The empire had been caught off guard by its own soldiers during wartime. To preserve morale and imperial prestige, the British downplayed the scale of the uprising in newspapers and official records. In India, the colonial government suppressed the story. The mutineers were portrayed as misguided criminals rather than political actors. Their connection to the Ghadar movement was minimized, as British authorities feared it would fuel further unrest in Punjab, Bengal, and beyond. Post-independence India also hesitated to embrace the narrative. Unlike freedom fighters who followed Gandhi or Subhas Chandra Bose, the Singapore mutineers operated outside the mainstream nationalist movements. Some saw them as violent, leaderless, and disconnected from the larger cause of Indian independence. Singapore, too, moved on. After gaining independence in 1965, the new nation focused on unity, progress, and harmony. The mutiny, involving communal violence and the killing of civilians, was not aligned with the state's post-colonial vision. It became a sensitive and rarely discussed topic. Only in recent decades have historians begun to revisit the mutiny. Archival discoveries and reassessments of the Ghadar movement revealed the global scale of Indian anti-colonial resistance. Museums and universities have gradually begun to acknowledge this forgotten rebellion. The Singapore Mutiny remains a buried truth, hidden in the shadows of empire, silence, and selective memory. Yet its lessons are timeless. That injustice, when ignored, festers. That loyalty can fracture, and that every rebellion, no matter how short-lived, leaves behind a mark on history. If you're passionate about uncovering the forgotten stories of our past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Don't forget to like the video if you're enjoying the journey so far. And stay tuned because there's so much more history waiting to be unearthed right here on Buried Truths.